In this video on how to construct the SumoBot, I'm going to show you how to assemble the gear set. So in your kit you're going to get a TAMIYA gear set. We're going to start today assembling our TAMIYA motor gearbox. Inside the box comes a set of instructions that you're going to need. We're going to build a low-speed 203:1 gear ratio gearbox with the outputs coming out of the center. We have a set of motors, some lube, some drive shafts, some bushings, and some screws in one package. We have the outer and center parts of the box that need to be cut out. And we have the left and right sets of gears. We have something called a SumoBox, and the purpose of the box is that we have to have a SumoBot that fits in a box that's 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. So you can see that this particular SumoBot doesn't fit in the box. And one of the main reasons is the wheels are too wide. So taking your vernier, we can see that an unmodified set of wheels, if we take the measurement here, is actually 10.8 centimeters. In order for our drive shaft to be the correct size to fit in our SumoBox, we're going to need to cut off 4 to 5 millimeters off of each of these output shafts. To do that, we're going to use a hacksaw. And I'm just going to put a mark on here so I know where to cut to. And I'll do the same for my other output shaft. Now I'll take it over to the hacksaw. I have my output shaft in my bench vise, and I'm just going to double check with my vernier that it is 5 millimeter. And now I'm going to make sure the vise is tight, and then I'm going to come in with my hacksaw and cut. So here's a close-up of the piece I just cut off. I want to remind you that when you cut through metal, where it's cut, it gets extremely hot. So don't be tempted to catch this little piece with your hand, because it does get very hot. You're going to need to take a file and file down the edges of where you cut your shaft. And try and get the end as flat as possible. So these are my two output shafts. The one on the right is the machined end that came. The one on the left is the one I just cut, and you can see I filed it down as best as I can. Got rid of all the rough edges on it so that I don't cut myself. By now a few people asked, why didn't you use the bandsaw? Well, I didn't use the bandsaw because I don't like getting my fingers that close to a moving blade. So the handheld hacksaw doesn't take too long, so I used it instead. So as I said earlier, these are your instructions, and we're going to be making the low speed gear ratio set, and it's C-type. So you need to find the instructions, which are on the back page, and this is the setup for the C-type. So the first thing we're going to do is get the drive shaft. We're going to put this lock nut on here, and we're just going to use the center piece of the gear assembly, and our shaft comes down to about here, and then we just put this lock nut on it. Now, as you can see, I've laid out all my parts. So here is the center of the gear assembly. Here is an output shaft. And here is one of those lock nuts that's going to go on there. And we have the set screw already put in. So I'm just going to slide that over. And I really want my good end to be on the outside because that's where I'm going to put my plastic wheel, and it's going to slide better off with the good end. So I'll just bring it down here. And what we're going to do is we're going to put it in the hole. And we don't want it to go all the way through, so just put your finger over one side. And then find your Allen key. And then just tighten it up. Now you don't want to use a lot of force on these parts because you could strip the screw. So there it is. There's our first one put on. While I'm here, I might just as well do the second one. So there's the first step done. My two output shafts. When putting the gear set together, we can see that the two shafts we're going to be using can fit in the side casing, and we can put on the first gear, then the second gear, and third gear, fourth gear, put on our final bushings, and put the center of the case together. When putting the second half of the gears together, we can see that we've already got our first shaft in, and our second shaft comes in from the opposite side. So this gear will go on first, and this gear can go on second, but then we can see that this gear has to mesh with this one, and it becomes a little bit tricky because this shaft comes in from this side due to this set screw here. We take our outer piece, so here is the output shaft, and it needs to go through a bushing. So our output shaft through a bushing, and it needs to go to a gear 3, which you can see has this little indent for the screw, right? So there it is on there with the screw. Next to it goes a gear number 2. So we need another shaft, a gear number 2, and it just slides on here. That is followed by a second gear number 2. So that slides on here. And finally followed by a gear number 1. You see little cogs face inwards. Okay, so here's the next piece that's going to go on. And before we do that, we need to know that there's going to be a bushing that goes in there. And we're going to have a bushing in each of these two holes. So a bushing in there, and a bushing in there. And into the bushings go our two spacers. And on our spacers we get another bushing. And then on goes the center half. It needs to be oriented correctly. I've got the bushing on the wrong side. Put the bushing in. Make sure it all lines up. So there's our first half put together. You can see when I rotate the output shaft, all the gears rotate. So into that I'm supposed to put 3 screws. So we have a screw here, and we'll just tighten that up there. Now don't over tight screws that screw into plastic, because you will strip the plastic. The screw will survive, but the plastic won't. So there's my 3 screws in. Now, when you do this, be careful that this last shaft here doesn't fall out, because then you'll have to wiggle your gears around again. Not a major issue, right? But make sure that one doesn't fall out when you're doing this. Then on the other side, we just do the opposite. So, I put in my bushing. And I need a bushing in each of these. Okay, so it's ready to go. Then my outer half, I need a bushing in the center one. In goes my output shaft. So this one has to be put together in reverse order. So I'm going to put my 2 bushings in here. So I know I've got all my bushings in the right place. Now this goes in together in reverse order. So my gear number 1 goes on here. My gear goes on here, right, with the little notch for the set screw. And on here I need a gear number 2. So that's going to go on that way. Before I finish that off, I need a gear number 2 on here. Oops. So in it goes, and I seem to have that about right. And then goes on my 2 spacers. And those bushings. And the bushing on the output shaft. And then slide the whole thing into place. There we go. And they approximately look the same. You can give them a little spin, make sure that they work. And now I just have to put my 3 screws to hold this assembly together. And like I said before, do not over tighten these screws. Just tighten them up until it feels tight. There we go. Now the next thing that we need to do is to put the motors in. And before we do that, we should grease all these gears. The grease that we're going to use needs to be a non-petroleum based grease. So anything that is an oil base, such as Vaseline's a petroleum jelly, it's an oil base. Anything that's oil based is going to eat through the plastic gears and damage them. Right, they're going to get soft, and So what I use is I'm using a phono lube. The kit came with a little tube of grease, so it's important to grease all the points that they show you in the instructions. I've got a tube of something called phono lube, which is for motors and gears and stuff. And all I need to do is, that's probably a bit more than I need, so I'm just going to goop that off there and use something like a small screwdriver and just kind of spread it around, get it on all the little gear surfaces. Now it's easier to put it on the smaller gears than it is the larger gears. So get her in there, and some on this one, and some more on this one, and a little more on this one, a little more on this one, a little more on this one. There we go. And then you can rotate your output shafts, and the grease should work its way into all those little cogs. Now, the next thing to do is we've got these little motors and we've got these little white pinion gears that need to go on. It's just a friction fit, so they basically just slide on. If you find they're a little bit tight, you can just put it on the bench and give it a little push and it'll stop at the shaft end. Sometimes these little gears, they get loose and they strip on the shaft and they just keep spinning and spinning. What you can do is you can take a punch and you can just go on the end of the shaft and give it a little dent in there, and then that will allow it to dig into these little gears. So these are brand new, so they should not strip. Now we need to put some lube on these little guys. And remember, you've got two of them, so you've got to do both of them. And now to mount them in here, you'll notice that we have two little tabs on here, and that's to wire them up to our circuit. Those little tabs need to go to the outside here. So when you're putting the motors in, they need to go to the outside. And they just slide in, and we can see that we have this little stop catch here. So once it gets in, it just clicks into place. So there's one in, and now I'm just going to slide the other one in, and it should click into place. So they both click into place now, and you notice because of the gear ratio on these little gearboxes, you can no longer rotate your gears because the motor is stopping them. So the gear set that has the little cogs pointing inwards, that one can be rotated, but this outer shaft can't. So the next thing we need to do is put some wheels on here. You'll need to break them out of whatever's holding them together, and you'll need to file off anything that's kind of protruding, because it will stop the tires from going onto these rims. So you'll need to just kind of go around and clean off anything on there. Make sure it's nice and smooth. And then your tires should just slide right over. And you want to make sure your tire gets right on the rim. And then these can go on your output shafts. And this assembly should be able to slide inside the Sumo box. Your kit also came with 2 screws that are used to mount this gear assembly to the aluminum chassis. So remember to keep them handy. If you take a look at the bottom of the gear assembly, you can see that there is a little space there for the nuts. So you can take these, place the nut in there, and then run the screw through the nut. That way you won't lose it. This completes the gear assembly. We've been assembling these SumoBots for a few years now, and a few problems have come to light. The first problem is which tire goes on which rim and which wheel goes on which output shaft. So if you're looking at your gear set from behind, so this is the back end of your SumoBot, and the mounting tabs go to the top because that's where it attaches to the aluminum chassis. So we have to agree that this output shaft is on the right and this output shaft is on the left. And if you look very closely at your tire, inside there is a little label. So this one has an R on it, so this is the right side tire. On this tire there's a little L inside, so this is the left side tire. So when you put your tires on your rims and mounted the wheel onto the output shaft, this is what the right tire should look like from above, and this is what the left tire should look like from above. Now I want to give you one last caution. This is the motor output, and we have the small gear on the inside driving a large gear. The small gear drives the large gear. So when you take a hold of your wheel and try and give it a turn, you'll notice it doesn't turn because it's a gear reduction, so the output shaft should be stiff. Now what a lot of students have been doing is they've been getting a hold of your wheel, and what they do is they give it a really hard turn to get those motors to go. Now the only problem with that is the wheel is actually plastic. So the first thing that's going to break on your wheel is going to be the plastic part. It's not going to be the metal shaft. And over time students have managed to just strip the plastic so that when they turn the wheel it no longer locks onto the output shaft. So please don't rotate your wheels once you have the motors hooked up to the gear set.